It's not every day you wake up, step outside with a cup of coffee, and find a convoy of 27 SUVs parked in your pasture like your ranch had become a Walmart parking lot overnight. I stood there, barefoot in the dewy grass, staring at the sea of shiny vehicles cutting ruts through my land, like some HOA-sponsored invasion force had mistaken my ranch for their God-given right. Buck, my bloodhound, let out a low grumble beside me. I didn't even have to look to know what he was thinking, because I was thinking it too. And as I stood there watching a woman in yoga pants set up a folding table right on top of my irrigation lines, I muttered, mostly to myself but loud enough for the wind to carry, "Karen's about to find out why ranchers don't share." It all started 2 weeks earlier, when I declined the HOA's little suggestion that I donate a corner of my pasture for extra community parking. I live just outside their perfectly paved suburb, where they patrol lawns like TSA agents and write citations for garden gnomes. My property isn't part of the HOA, it never has been, never will be, but that's never stopped Karen. She's the president of their little dictatorship, and carries herself like a mayor in a town of 4. She doesn't knock when she visits, she announces herself by honking twice and stepping out like she owns the ground she walks on. Last time she showed up, it was to gently remind me that my rooster was violating the peace. I reminded her that the rooster lives here and she doesn't. I thought that was the end of it, but no. Karen isn't the kind of woman who takes rejection as a final answer. Apparently, she had some big HOA event planned, a backyard barbecue and silent auction for community beautification, whatever the hell that means. Only problem? Not enough parking. Instead of renting a church lot like a sane person, she decided to play queen of the countryside and told everyone they could just use that open ranch land across the fence. My land. So that morning, with the sun just barely kissing the edge of the hills, I stood in flannel pajama pants and watched Karen parade around my property like she was giving a TED Talk. She wore a sash that said "Community Leader" in glitter letters and carried a walkie-talkie like she was directing a military operation. A man in khakis rolled out a portable smoker next to my chicken coop. Someone else started putting tiki torches in the ground. And there, right in the center of my hayfield, a DJ booth started to rise. I walked down the gravel path, slow and calm, sipping my coffee like it wasn't about to be the last peaceful moment I'd have for the next few hours. As I approached, Karen turned toward me with that smug little half-smile, the kind people wear when they know they're about to say something incredibly stupid but think it sounds smart. "Good morning. Isn't this great? We're bringing people together. Don't worry, we'll clean up after." I said nothing for a moment. Just stared at the white Lexus she'd parked half on my irrigation spigot. The wheel was already sinking into the mud. I looked back at her and finally spoke. "You invited the whole HOA to park on my land without asking." She waved a hand like she was swatting away a fly. "Oh, come on. You've got all this space and nothing going on. It's just for the day." That's when I smiled. Not a nice smile. The kind that means someone's about to learn a lesson they won't forget. "Well, since you invited them to my land," I said, backing away slowly, "I suppose my ranch dogs should welcome them properly." Karen blinked. "Excuse me." But I was already walking back to the kennel. Now let me explain something about my dogs. Buck is older than sin and twice as mean before breakfast. He's a bloodhound with a nose like a vacuum and a bark that could rattle drywall. Sadie is a blue heeler mix who treats strangers like they're cattle to be herded, usually through fences. And Moose? Moose is a Great Pyrenees the size of a small bear who thinks he's still a lapdog. He doesn't bark much. He just stares, then moves, then someone gets knocked over. I opened the gate. It wasn't immediate chaos, more like a slow, spreading ripple. Buck trotted out first, his nose already twitching with curiosity and disdain. Sadie came next, tail high, ears alert. Moose brought up the rear like a freight train in a fur coat. They didn't charge. They sauntered, confidently, purposefully. And then someone screamed. I didn't see what happened first. Maybe it was Buck sniffing someone's expensive smoked brisket and deciding it needed redistribution. Maybe Sadie ran straight at the lawn games and sent croquet balls flying. Maybe Moose climbed into the back of someone's Lexus and refused to leave. Whatever it was, within 60 seconds the calm HOA event turned into a full-blown stampede of screaming adults, crying children, and one poor man desperately trying to salvage a tray of deviled eggs from under Moose's belly. Karen came running toward me, red-faced and furious. "You can't just let them loose." I shrugged. "It's my property, Karen. No leash laws out here." She opened her mouth to argue, then stopped as Buck barked, a deep, guttural sound that made her flinch. She backed up slowly, muttering something about animal control and lawsuit. By the time the sheriff showed up, my dogs were all lounging in the shade like nothing happened. Sheriff Dan stepped out of his cruiser, took one look at the disaster zone, and walked over to me with a grin. "Your dogs throwin' another party?" he asked, sipping from a thermos. Apparently the HOA didn't RSVP this time. He looked over the mess. Karen came storming up, demanding arrests, citations, divine intervention. Dan looked her dead in the eyes and said, "Ma'am, you parked without permission on private property, and his dogs are within their rights to roam it. Maybe you oughta find a different venue next time." She stood there, sputtering, mascara starting to smudge in the sun, and I swear to God, Moose walked over and sat on her foot. I sipped the last of my coffee. Welcome to the ranch. The thing about dogs, especially mine, is that once they get a taste of the party life, they expect it to be a regular occurrence. The next morning, Buck sat by the porch staring at the field like he was waiting for the buffet to come back. Sadie did her rounds along the fence line with more enthusiasm than usual, ears perked for signs of intruders or stray potato salad. Moose lay in the same exact spot he had collapsed in after body slamming the DJ booth, snoring with one paw over his face like a hungover cowboy. The chaos of the HOA invasion was still written across the ranch like tire tracks in the mud, but for the dogs, it was just another chapter in their never-ending mission to protect their land from the forces of nonsense. I wasn't even mad. If anything, I was impressed by how efficiently my dogs had restored order. Within 20 minutes of their grand entrance, every HOA guest had fled back to their cars, picnic baskets abandoned mid-snack. One woman had climbed onto the hood of her BMW and refused to come down until Buck was bribed with a hot dog. Another guy tried to run, tripped over a sprinkler head, and landed face-first in a cow patty. Moose had taken an odd liking to the local real estate agent and wouldn't stop following her until she jumped a fence and disappeared into the neighbor's goat field. It was mayhem, but it was honest mayhem. The kind you remember when you're old and want a good story to tell. Of course, I knew it wouldn't be the end. Karen never loses quietly. She disappears to plan, stews until her passive aggression thickens into something resembling legalese, then returns in a whirlwind of paper and accusations. Sure enough, the very next day I received my first official notice in the mail. It was hand-delivered by a kid on a scooter, folded 3 times, and stamped with the HOA's extremely dramatic golden crest. The letter accused me of hosting unregistered livestock events without prior approval. I read it twice, mostly for the laugh. Buck stared at it like he wanted to pee on it. I let him. Then came the flyers. Karen plastered the neighborhood with pamphlets claiming I was endangering public safety by harboring unruly animals. She claimed Moose was a known biter, Buck had the eyes of a criminal, and Sadie had rabies, despite the fact that Sadie spent most of her time herding tumbleweeds. The flyers featured blurry screenshots from someone's phone during the chaos, Moose mid-bark, Buck halfway into a cooler, and Sadie sniffing a toddler's shoelaces like she was trying to read his soul. I kept a few for my scrapbook. Soon after, Karen called animal control. They showed up one afternoon while I was feeding the chickens, looking both confused and apologetic. A young guy in uniform approached the gate with a clipboard and a deep sigh. "Got a complaint about aggressive dogs," he said. "Let me guess," I said. From a woman with a laminated badge that says, HOA President, and a car that smells like lavender rage? He chuckled. Something like that. I invited him in. Buck sniffed him once and wandered off. Sadie sat politely by his boot and wagged her tail. Moose rolled over in the grass like a sunbathing rug. By the time the officer left, he'd taken 3 selfies with Moose, asked for Sadie's breeder information, and given Buck a peanut butter treat from his back pocket. I'll file it as unfounded, he said, getting back into his truck. Though I might suggest putting up a "Beware of Dogs" sign just to mess with her. I took his advice. Not only did I hang a sign, I added a few extras. Caution: dogs can smell entitlement. Trespassers will be herded. We bark back. The signs became a bit of a tourist attraction. People from nearby streets came by just to take pictures. Karen drove by twice a day, each time slower than the last, her neck craning like she was trying to catch me committing a felony with a garden hose. But the real joy came a few days later, when I heard a vehicle engine idling outside my fence line. I walked out to find a man unloading gear from the back of a van. He wore khakis, a county badge, and the confused look of someone who'd been misled. "Morning," he said. "I'm here to conduct an inspection." "For what?" HOA filed a complaint. Said your fencing and dog enclosures are non-compliant with county safety ordinances. I almost laughed. Instead, I handed him a lemonade and invited him to take the tour. Buck walked beside us like a bodyguard. I showed him every gate latch, water trough, and shaded kennel. I even introduced him to the chickens, who were clucking in protest over the lack of visitors to harass since the HOA party got shut down. Halfway through the inspection, he paused and squinted at my tool shed. "Is that solar-powered?" I nodded. "Built it myself. Mind if I take a picture?" "Help yourself." By the end of the visit, he'd complimented the craftsmanship, told me my fencing was better than most county parks, and asked if he could bring his son by sometime to meet the dogs. "Kid's obsessed with Pyrenees," he said, scratching Moose behind the ears. I grinned. "Moose loves fans." He drove off with a thumbs up. 5 minutes later, Karen drove by and saw me high-fiving the inspector. That night, I checked the footage from my new wildlife cams. I had installed them mostly out of curiosity, wanted to see if the deer were getting into the compost again. What I didn't expect was a motion alert ping at 2:13 a.m. I opened the video file and nearly spit out my water. There was Karen, in full camouflage, sneaking across the fence line like a cartoon burglar. She tripped once, swore loudly, and crawled to my tool shed like she was in a spy movie. At one point, she pulled out a flashlight, then dropped it into a bucket of chicken feed, and spent 3 full minutes trying to fish it out. The chickens, awakened by the rustling, launched an angry protest. One of them, Henrietta, my biggest Rhode Island red, chased her halfway back to the fence. She escaped, barely, limping and covered in straw, her yoga pants streaked with something dark I dearly hoped was only mud. The camera caught it all. Multiple angles. Crystal clear night vision. I saved the footage. Backed it up. Made popcorn. Karen had just declared war. And I had surveillance-grade ammunition. Karen didn't show her face for 3 full days after her late-night chicken feed adventure, which told me one of 2 things. Either she was healing from the embarrassment or nursing wounds in places she didn't want to explain to a doctor. But just as the ranch started to feel peaceful again, like the world was finally tipping back toward normal, the storm clouds gathered. I should have known that someone who considers a clipboard a weapon wouldn't give up so easily. Karen had moved from petty to strategic. She wasn't just looking for revenge anymore. She was building a case. It started subtly. First, I noticed a drone hovering near the property line during breakfast. It buzzed over the chicken coop, zipped around the barn, and then tried to dip low over the dog run until Sadie jumped high enough to swat at it midair. I stood there in my bathrobe holding a frying pan like I might swing for a home run. The drone retreated, but not before I saw the HOA logo sticker slapped on its tail like it was part of their official fleet. That same afternoon, a man in a reflective vest walked up to my gate and asked if I was aware that my barn roof might be in violation of Historic Preservation Code. I told him my barn was built in 2003 and the only history it had was a raccoon infestation back in 2014. He made a few notes on his clipboard and left in a hurry when Moose came trotting over with his tongue hanging out and a look that said he wasn't in the mood for visitors. The next letter from the HOA was thicker than usual. A full packet. It accused me of 15 separate infractions, ranging from unregistered livestock noise pollution to visual obstructions created by excessive haystacking. It claimed that my pasture disrupted the optical flow of the neighborhood landscape, which sounded like a complaint written by someone who'd once lost an argument with a tree. I laughed all the way through reading it until I got to the last page. There, in big bold letters, it said that Karen had called for a formal review of whether my property posed a continued threat to community harmony and property values. That last part ticked me off. Not just because it was ridiculous, but because it was dangerous. If she managed to spin her nonsense into a public hearing, I'd be dragged through weeks of paperwork and inspections. So I decided it was time to hit back, not with aggression, but precision. First, I gathered everything. All the drone footage, every ridiculous flyer, every visit from her HOA henchman. Then I dug into county records. I found that Karen had applied for a fence permit 6 months ago and still hadn't finished the installation. Turns out she'd been storing lumber and cement on a lot that wasn't technically hers. It was on the legal border between HOA land and the utility company's right-of-way. I called in a friendly tip. A crew came out 2 days later, scratched their heads, took some photos, and slapped a big orange sticker on her fencing material. Karen came outside mid-inspection, robe flapping in the wind, and started arguing with a man holding a level and a very unimpressed clipboard. Second, I decided it was time to release the footage. Not to the public. Not yet. Just to the HOA board. I printed still shots from the video, Karen tripping, flailing, being chased by a chicken, and put them in an envelope marked, Private HOA Security Concern. I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. The images spoke louder than any words could. I dropped the envelope off in the Dropbox outside the HOA clubhouse and waited. A week later, whispers started circulating around the neighborhood. Karen wasn't smiling as much. She didn't show up to her usual morning jog with her labradoodle, which everyone knew she only did to hand out unsolicited citations. One of the board members, a sweet older lady named Doris, waved me down at the gas station and asked if I had any more of those hilarious security photos. I played dumb. She winked and said, "That chicken's a hero." But just when I thought I had her on the ropes, Karen launched her biggest stunt yet. She arranged for an official emergency HOA meeting, unprecedented, she said, but entirely necessary to address the growing disturbance at the edge of our community. I was sent a formal invitation, which was less of an invite and more of a dare. The meeting was held in the community center. It was decorated with faux ferns, plastic fruit bowls, and a banner that said, "Together we thrive," in Comic Sans. I showed up in jeans and a clean flannel, carrying nothing but a thumb drive and a bag of kettle corn. Karen was already at the podium, dressed like she was running for office, a slide projector warming up behind her. She launched into her presentation like a lawyer on a courtroom drama. She called me uncooperative, unstable, and at one point, the single greatest threat to peace since the HOA's inception. She showed blurry pictures of Buck barking and a photo of Moose lying across someone's lawn chair like he'd claimed it in conquest. The room was dead silent. Karen ended with a flourish, calling for a vote to issue a formal demand for the county to intervene. Then I stood up. I walked to the front, plugged in my thumb drive, and played a short video clip. No commentary. Just night vision footage of Karen stumbling across my property at 2 a.m., cursing, falling into chicken feed, and running from Henrietta like her soul depended on it. The room erupted. Some gasped. Some laughed. One man clapped. Karen turned a color I didn't know the human face could turn. She lunged for the projector, yanked the cord, and started shouting about deep fakes and unauthorized surveillance. The board president raised a hand. "Karen, were you or were you not on his property that night?" She stammered. "I was investigating a code violation." "In the dark? With a flashlight in a feed bucket?" Someone snorted. Karen snapped. "He's manipulating you. This man weaponized his animals." The president sighed and looked at the others. "Let's vote." In under a minute, Karen was suspended from her position pending review. She stormed out, knocking over a decorative palm tree and shouting something about contacting her cousin, who's a paralegal in Ohio. I stayed for the rest of the meeting, handed out kettle corn, and told anyone who'd listen that Moose was available for parties and weddings. Doris asked if I could bring the dogs to the community picnic, as long as they're not hungry. That night, I sat on the porch with the dogs sprawled around me. I watched the sunset and cracked open a root beer, the warm kind that only tastes good after a small victory. Karen had started a war, but I had something she'd never understand: loyal dogs, thick skin, and a whole lot of land that didn't answer to her clipboard. The sun rose slow and heavy over the hills the morning of the HOA's official follow-up meeting, casting long shadows across the fields like it knew something dramatic was about to go down. The ranch was calm, eerily so, like the quiet before a storm, or the moment before a rodeo bull explodes out of the gate. Even the dogs were different. Buck sat like a statue near the barn, watching the driveway like a sentry. Sadie circled the fence with laser focus. Moose had parked himself right next to the porch swing and refused to budge, like he was bracing for a front-row seat to the final showdown. I figured they sensed it, that strange electric feeling in the air. Karen's last stand was coming. Since her suspension, Karen had gone full conspiracy theorist. She blamed the board, the county, the neighbors, the post office, and me personally for ruining her life's work. She filed appeals, wrote newsletters laced with all-caps words like tyranny and infiltration, and even held a protest outside the HOA clubhouse where she handed out stale cookies and brochures accusing me of dog-assisted terrorism. She was unraveling, but even a tangled-up rope can trip you if you're not careful. I wasn't underestimating her anymore. I was preparing. The final board meeting was open to the public, and word had spread like wildfire. People brought lawn chairs, coolers, and someone even parked a food truck on the edge of the community center parking lot. It felt more like a county fair than a civic proceeding. I arrived with the dogs in tow, each of them freshly brushed, wearing matching red bandanas with embroidered tags that read community security. Moose wore sunglasses. I didn't put them on him. He found them in the truck and refused to take them off. Buck just looked proud to be involved. Sadie acted like she was going to herd the board members into their chairs and demand a roll call. Inside the hall, the tension was thick. The board sat at the front, trying their best to look neutral while sipping coffee from mismatched mugs. Karen stood to the side near a folding table, surrounded by 3 large poster boards filled with what I could only assume were screenshots, charts, and probably a few poorly labeled maps of my property. She saw me and the dogs walk in and immediately spun toward the president. "You can't let them in," she hissed. "They're a disruption." The president, a man named Roger with a permanent frown and an allergy to nonsense, simply said, "They've been better behaved than half the board, Karen. Let's get started." Karen launched into her defense like she'd been practicing it in the mirror every night for a month. She called me an instigator, accused my dogs of mental intimidation, and claimed her trespassing incident was a misunderstood attempt at reconciliation. She even tried to say that the footage I shared was illegally obtained and emotionally manipulated with soundtrack enhancements. I wanted to laugh when she used the term forensic tampering, as if I had some underground editing bunker powered by my chickens. After 20 minutes of ranting, spinning, and flailing, Karen brought out her final argument, a motion to seize a portion of my land for community easement, claiming that my underutilized acreage should be reassigned for the public good. The room fell silent. No one expected that. It was a bold move, borderline delusional, and absolutely doomed, but she was banking on the shock value. She looked around the room like she expected applause. Instead, someone coughed, and Buck growled low from beneath my chair. I stood up slowly and walked to the front. I didn't need props. I didn't need a speech. I just opened a manila folder and handed Roger a document, copies of land ownership papers, boundary line filings, and most importantly, a recent transaction showing that the very lot their clubhouse was sitting on had been quietly sold to me 2 months earlier. Karen didn't know it yet, but while she'd been trying to get my pasture turned into a parking lot, I'd been finalizing a deal with the previous owner of the HOA's land lease. They had failed to renew. The land was mine. Karen stared at the paper in Roger's hands as the color drained from her face. I leaned in slightly and said, just loud enough for the board to hear, if you're looking for underutilized space, you might want to start with the building you're standing in. That was the moment the room erupted. Some people gasped. Some clapped. Someone shouted, "Get wrecked!" from the back, and I didn't even care who it was. Karen tried to grab the paperwork, shouting that it had to be fake, that this was all part of a larger plot to unseat her, like she'd been Queen of England instead of a suburban tyrant with a Pinterest addiction. Moose stepped forward and, with perfect timing, let out the loudest sneeze I've ever heard from a dog. Karen jumped like she'd been shot, stumbled backward into her own display board, and knocked it clean over. A cascade of glitter glue charts and laminated citations fluttered to the floor like a paper blizzard. Roger cleared his throat and looked at the board. I think we've seen enough. All in favor of terminating Karen's position and revoking her special privileges. Every hand went up. Even Doris, who once tried to defend Karen because she seemed lonely, didn't hesitate. Karen let out a sound somewhere between a scream and a wail and stormed out the door, knocking over the donation jar labeled Community Beautification on the way. No one stopped her. Someone outside started playing banjo music. I swear, even the wind shifted direction like it was ready to move on. That evening, the board sent me an email formally apologizing and asking if I would consider leasing the clubhouse lot back to them at a reasonable rate. I told them I'd think about it. In truth, I already had a better idea. A week later, I hosted a party on the ranch. Everyone was invited, except Karen, of course. We set up tables under the big oak tree, fired up the smoker, and even brought in a bluegrass band. Moose wore a bow tie. Sadie herded children like it was her day job. Buck lounged by the grill and accepted bites of brisket from anyone who made eye contact. Someone printed t-shirts that said, "Welcome Committee. Ranch Division," with a cartoon of the dogs chasing a clipboard. As the sun went down, people laughed, danced, and enjoyed the land Karen once tried to take over. The barn lights glowed like golden lanterns, and the dogs curled up on hay bales while fireflies flickered across the field. I looked around and saw a community, not the forced kind with rules and fines, but the real kind built on mutual respect and maybe just a little shared dislike of a common enemy. Karen was gone. The HOA had been humbled, and the ranch, as always, remained mine.